Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to start with the webinar. Welcome everyone to this webinar on the credit mechanism, which is part of the recently adopted Renewable Energy Directive. This webinar is organized jointly by ChargeUp Europe and Transport and Environment, uniting our expertise on the subject matter to empower the EV charging industry, national governments, and EV charging industry representatives on the national level. My name is Gabriela Šimakauskaitė. I am the policy manager at ChargeUp Europe, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Now, since you are here, I assume that you would have some knowledge of the mechanism, but I do want to spend a few minutes on it before we dive into many interesting presentations that our speakers have prepared for us today. So the Renewable Energy Directive was recently published in the official journal of the European Union. The transposition deadline was set for May 2025. In acknowledgement of the increasing importance of electricity as a transport fuel, the directive obliges the EU member states to introduce a mechanism which will allow operators of public recharging points to sell credits for the renewable electricity used to charge electric vehicles to fuel suppliers. This mechanism will be mandatory for public charging and optional for private charging. This is a significant development in the EV charging sector for several reasons. First of all, this shows that the role of the electricity in transport is increasing. This means that more and more electric vehicles will be entering the European roads and will continue to do so in the coming years. Secondly, this will also allow the EV charging industry to offer an even better service to the user, which is at the core of the industry's mission. Today, our experts will walk you through the Renewable Energy Directive itself and through the French, German, and Dutch credit mechanisms, how they work in practice, and how a charge point operator can benefit from these mechanisms to optimize their business. We are certain that this information will be interesting not only to the industry, but also to the representatives of those member states in which the mechanisms are not fully developed yet or are only in the ideation stage. The goal of today is to learn from what's already in place in 3 EU member states. To make sure that you all have your questions answered, do not hesitate to submit them through the Q&A function, which is just at the top of your screen. With all of this said, we are now going to move into the presentations. So we are going to start with Gert de Kok, who is the Electricity and Energy Manager at Transport and Environment. Gert will talk about the Renewable Energy Directive, provisions on the credit mechanism, and how it is structured. Gert, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Gabriele, for the introduction. So yeah, we're Transport and Environment, and we are an environmental group based in Brussels, and we are very keen to promote electromobility and also to make sure that renewable electricity can also count as a transport fuel towards these red targets. And this is why we have a keen interest in this topic. If we go to the next slide. So everything I will cover in this presentation is elaborated in a lot more detail in this briefing, which you can find on the website. There's a link there. So if things are not clear or after the webinar you want to check in on things, this is a hefty 26-page briefing on the topic that dives into really all the details that you might want. To the next slide. So yeah, what are we really talking about? We're for the first time, and I think this is really one of the more significant innovations in the Renewable Energy Directive, like the third version of it, is that we now have a credit mechanism. So what does this mean? It means that for the first time, it will allow more than just liquid fuels to be able to contribute to the renewable energy target. So for transport. So this is something where more fuels, there will be more compliance options for fuel suppliers. So typically oil companies to be able to meet their targets that are set at the national level. So it is a possibility to exchange credits between different fuel suppliers. And more importantly, it also allows, it recognizes, as Gabriele said, the growing role of electricity as a transport fuel. And it allows renewable electricity to also contribute towards the target. So this is very important. It means that, you know, in all those member states where you have biofuel blending mandates, that you need to have additional a credit mechanism that gets added to that system so that you also can have renewable electricity count as a transport fuel. So this is a major innovation, and it is not an option, it is mandatory for the EU 27 member states to roll this out in their national laws. So this is something that needs to happen in the next by mid 2025. This needs to be in place in all member states. So this is going to require a lot of work. And it is mandatory for member states to allow renewable electricity that is charged at public recharging points to count towards the target. So this is something that is really the key, the core of the change. There's also an opening towards also counting private recharging, so that also in recognition of the fact that actually 70% or thereabouts of all the charging will happen at private charging points. So this is an opening that is made. This is not mandatory, but it does recognize in the law that private recharging, also accounts for a big part of it. And yeah, this new change really recognizes that without electric vehicles, it will be impossible to reach the more ambitious targets, and that with a growing fleet of electric vehicles, it doesn't make sense to try and reach all the higher targets with just biofuels. So this is really a major change. We can go to the next slide. So yeah, what we have nowadays in the EU 27 is that the EU 23 at the bottom there, the most member states just say to fuel suppliers, you must blend X percentage of all the fossil fuels must be made up of, you must blend X% of biofuels with the fossil fuel. So this is the situation in most countries today. There's a couple of front runners like Netherlands, Germany, France, and Austria, most of which will be covered today, that have already implemented such a credit mechanism, that were a bit ahead of the curve in recognizing the importance of electric vehicles in reaching the targets, but also the important role that these credits can play to also improve the business case of public charging and to roll out and facilitate the rollout and deployment of public chargers. So what happens is that with the top part of this image, is that you take the renewable electricity share that is charged at public charging points, and for that you can get credits as a charge point operator, and those credits can be sold to fossil fuel companies. And the next slide will make that a bit more clear, how that works in practice. So for example, you have a fuel supplier, it must meet a certain percent of renewable energy and transport, let's say 29%, as was agreed in the Renewable Energy Directive. Just picked a random oil company, Shell. They have many options now. They can either produce biofuels themselves, or they can buy biofuels. In this credit mechanism, they can also buy biofuel credits from another oil company and use that to meet their targets. And then what we're most interested in today is option 4, and in particular 5, is that they can either, number 4, they can operate their own charging points and generate credits that way and meet the targets with their own charging points, or they can buy credits from third parties that already operate charge points, and again, a random sample of charge point operators. So what this shows is that you have a lot more compliance options that are become available to fuel suppliers, to oil companies that are the obligated parties that need to meet these targets. Next slide. So the bulk or the core of the provision is around the public charging. There's several ways to do that. What we see in most member states in Europe is that you actually look at the metered kilowatt hours at the charge point, and some of the next presentations will go into detail onto how you meter that. But yeah, you look at the actual kilowatt hours charged, and you multiply that by the average renewable energy that is on the grid over the past 2 years, or you look at the carbon intensity of the grid, the average carbon intensity of the grid. So it's not about instantaneous measuring how much renewable electricity there is, but you look at sort of an average over the years, and then based on that average, you know how many kilowatt hours are considered to be renewable, and on that basis you get the credits. There's another option to do capacity crediting. That's I thought was an interesting example from California, from the low carbon fuel standard there, where you look at a total recharging capacity, so the maximum number of kilowatt hours that can be charged over a day. You deduct the actual charging, and on that basis, you get credits for the unused recharging capacity. That's, of course, quite a generous move, that you don't actually look at the actual charging. But yeah, that can be maybe interesting for some specific use cases or business cases where, for example, yeah, remote locations where there's not actually a lot of charging happening, but you nevertheless want to encourage the rollout of public chargers. Or you can also think of, for example, truck charging, where maybe it's very particularly challenging to have these high capacity chargers rolled out. And yeah, there's more details in the briefing on how to do that. Then we'll go to the next slide. So I think that the private charging is quite interesting, because yeah, it accounts for a lot of the charging that will happen at home or in the workplace, or at depots. But then of course it is quite challenging to track behind the meter what is the actual charging that is happening. Does the kilowatt hour go into the microwave, the oven, or into the electric vehicle? So this is this is hard to know where the in contrast to a public charging point where there's no other really electricity consumption except for supplying the electricity to the electric vehicle. I found that Germany's instrument, the THG-Quote, the Treibhausgasquote, so the greenhouse gas mandate, found quite an elegant solution in that they work with fixed values. So they sort of estimate the private kilowatt hours charged per year for different vehicle classes, and they award sort of a credit on that basis. So for electric vehicles, it's about, I think for an average EV, it's about maybe 13,000 kilometers that they estimate. And on that basis, they say, well, for an electric vehicle privately charged, that's about 2 megawatt hours per year. And then they look at other classes of vehicles. Vans get a bit more, given their higher mileage, so they get 3,000 kilowatt hours. For trucks and for so they have different classes of trucks. They have also values, and then what we're seeing, particularly for the bigger trucks, is that the values, these values were quite okay for vans and cars, but for the trucks, particularly the bigger trucks, these values are quite unrepresentative. So if we're considering private charging, this is it's important to keep in mind that these values need to be representative, of course, of the actual mileage and the actual energy consumption of these trucks on a yearly basis. So that's something to keep in mind when discussing this, and there's detailed proposal in our briefing on that point. And then the next slide. So we're talking substantial revenue that can come from this. I mean, for a car or a van, I think it's quite modest in terms of revenues. Nevertheless, we see a lot of electric vehicles, a lot of private vehicle owners enroll their car in this system, in the German credit charging system. So yeah, the values may be on an annual basis may not be that significant, but it does help to maybe offset some of the electricity and the charging costs for the cars and the vans. But for buses and trucks, you really start to see significant money coming in on a yearly basis, and this is not limited in time. So this is something that is quite significant and can really help improve the total cost of ownership for these buses and trucks for going electric. So this is something to really keep in mind once you get some real bigger of these fixed values awarded. And then my last slide. So one thing that is really crucial and that needs to be recognized when implemented across all member states is that direct electrification of transport and electric vehicles in particular are really very efficient compared to combustion engine vehicles. And so you need some kind of compensation. In the Renewable Energy Directive, there's a multiplier that gets added, or a dedicated greenhouse gas savings comparator. So it is very important that you recognize the higher energy efficiency of electric vehicles, because if you just look at final energy consumption, then renewable electricity will never be able to count as an attractive compliance option for fuel suppliers. So this multiplier of 4, that is something that I really want to emphasize as an important element. So I think this is the end of my presentation, and I'll hand it back to Gabriele.
Thank you, Gert, very much for laying out this helpful foundation and for explaining what do we actually see in the Renewable Energy Directive and making it more understandable. We will now move on to Jaap Bousema, who is the head of unit ad interim energy for transport at the Dutch Emissions Authority. He will be presenting the setup and the running of the Dutch Renewable Energy Directive credit mechanism from the credit mechanisms administrator's perspective. So Jaap, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Jaap Bousema. I hope you all hear me well. I work for the Dutch Emissions Authority at the department which is responsible for the well-functioning of the Dutch HBE system. HBE is the Dutch abbreviation for Renewable Energy Unit. This is the national system that we have in place in order to realize our national renewable energy target for transport under the RED and FQD directives. NIA is the assigned competent authority to make sure that companies know what to do in this system, know how to use the registry, and ultimately fulfill their obligations. And we supervise their registrations and impose sanctions if necessary. Next slide, please. To quickly dive into it, in the Netherlands, we have set an obligation on all individual fuel suppliers of petrol and gas oil brought on the Dutch transport market that is delivered for end use in the Netherlands. For every year, each fuel supplier has a target to fulfill, a required minimum share of renewable energy as part of the total fuel delivery. The target for this year is 18.9%, with higher percentages every year, ending up at 28% in 2030. Within this annual obligation, the share of conventional biofuels and biofuels from used fats and oils have a fixed limited contribution of 1.4% and 10% respectively. Furthermore, a minimum share of the annual obligation must be fulfilled with advanced biofuels based on waste and residues. This is 2.4% in 2023, gradually rising up to 7% in 2030. The annual obligation does not necessarily need to be met by the fuel supplier by having him physically blending in bioethanol or biodiesel in his fuels. No, it must be fulfilled by surrendering sufficient HBEs. HBEs are tradable units which stand for a delivery of renewable energy of any kind somewhere on the Dutch market. Next slide, please. So it is a market mechanism, all being managed in the registry energy for transport that we maintain. At the end of the year, every company with an annual obligation must once a year surrender enough HBEs to comply with his annual obligation. He obtains the HBEs mostly by trading, by buying HBEs on the market. The origin of all the HBEs is in the booking of deliveries of renewable energy in the NIA registry. Such a booking results directly in HBEs. So an HBE represents a proven delivery of renewable energy brought to the Dutch market. In practice, of course, the obligated company might also deliver renewable fuels himself, renewable energy, to create HBEs for his own annual obligation. We as NIA do not supervise the HBE trading. There's brokers and traders being active to connect suppliers and demanders of HBEs on the market. Next slide, please. HBEs are created within the NIA registry. In general, for every gigajoule of renewable energy, 1 HBE is granted directly on the registry account of the company which booked the delivery. Because of the different limits and sub-target we have for advanced biofuels, we currently have 4 types of HBEs in our national system. differing in the extent to which they may be used to fulfill the annual obligation. For deliveries of renewable electricity, HBO are issued, standing for HB Other, the rest category for non-capped and non-sub-targeted forms of renewable energy. For other types of renewable energy, other types of HBEs are granted, as you see on this slide. Next, please. To make it more concrete with an example, if a company delivers 1 million gigajoules of petrol to the market, he has an obligation of 18.9%, so 189,000 HBEs to surrender, of which at least 24,000, the 2.4%, should be of the advanced kind. This means that other HBEs can also be used to fulfill the obligation. The remaining gap of 165,000 HBEs can be filled with, for example, HBE Other, which are not capped, so potentially have an important share, this HBE result of renewable electricity. Next slide, please. And I think immediately the next as well. Let's now focus on the bookings of electricity. What are the main principles that we have in the Netherlands for rewarding electricity with HBEs? The legislation is set up in such a way that there is no mistake about who is the legal entity that can book a delivery of renewable electricity. Only one entity can apply for a specific delivery. This is very important for us as a supervisor, because when we started the system, there were many companies being interested in the HBEs, so we wanted to have a clear basis on who could be the booker. Secondly, only the renewable share of electricity delivered can be rewarded with HBEs, of course. Then deliveries must be measured with good and accurate equipment. In most cases, the meters on which the final invoices are based. The booked quantity needs to be registered at some point where there is a volume of electricity exclusively destined for transport. So no flows going to the microwave and such may be booked. And no estimations or assumptions are part of the system, only measured data. And very important, it is voluntary to register as a booker to create HBEs, but once you do so, you have to fulfill several obligations. You are subject to the supervision of NIA. We can also impose sanctions if we see that deliveries were booked that were not correct. And as a booker, you must also surrender every year a verifier statement to NIA. You have to contract and pay a verifier to check the bookings you did in the system. Next slide, please. Then who are the eligible bookers of electricity in the Netherlands? Not a really readable figure, I suppose. So in words, there's many companies involved in the electricity chain that are involved in one way or another. Many companies involved in the administration of the charging itself. But in the Netherlands, it was decided that only the company which is responsible for the end delivery to the vehicles may apply for HBEs, not the end user, not an operator such as the charging service provider that lacks a legal definition. The ministry wanted a legal, clear definition to limit the bookers to those companies which have a connection to the grid from which they extract electricity to deliver to transport, because it is those operators that have a contract with the energy supplier, so they know what they receive, and they also have information about what is actually being delivered to vehicles, how much kilowatt hours. Next slide, please. At this moment, only deliveries of electricity to road transport and to inland shipping can be booked, also shore power. Railways are still excluded and will remain excluded. And non-road mobile machinery at this stage is also not eligible for HBEs, but this might change in the future. Next slide. Then a calculation example, an important question: how many HBEs do you receive as a company for a booking? Several factors are relevant. Of course, the calculation factor from kilowatt hours to gigajoules to calculate the number of HBEs to be granted. Also, the renewable electricity share, which may result in HBEs, and the weighting factor that Geert also mentioned of 4 coming directly from the RED. For grid deliveries, a booking of 1,000 kilowatt hours in the Netherlands results using these factors in rounded 4 HBEs on the account of the booker. But for 100% renewable electricity, the same calculation applies with resulting in a rounded 14 HBEs. So it really makes sense if you do a grid delivery or a fully renewable delivery. For your interest, HBE's prices differ a lot. The price since July 2022 varied from 6 to 18 euros, depending on several market factors. So there is a big change in this market price, really relevant to do the calculations. And also for a clear picture, the total annual obligation in 2022, so the demand for HBEs was 74.4 million for 39 fuel suppliers, and this number rises every year according to the rising annual obligation. Next slide, please. Of course, it's no paperwork, no doable. All creation of HBEs or all trading of HBEs and all surrendering of HBEs takes place in the Registry Energy for Transport, a web application that we maintain as NIA. Next slide. Every year we have an annual closure for the bookings. Bookings of deliveries of renewable energy over the previous year can be done in the registry up to the 1st of March of the next year. And before the 1st of May, every booker must send a verification statement to NIA showing that the deliveries were checked by an independent verifier. Then on the 1st of May, bookers will see their HBEs disappearing. They should have transferred it to the obligated parties before the 1st of May. Then we subscribe all the HBEs from the obligated parties, and only the HBEs above certain saving limits will remain in the system. And for bookers, this is 10% of what they booked in the previous year. All extra HBEs will be deleted automatically from their account. Next slide, and I think the final slide, a short preview on the 2025 system. There are several issues that must be tackled for the RED 3 implementation before 2025, when we change to a new system. From 2025, we will no longer have this gigajoule-based system, but we will have a system of tradable units based on emission reduction of grams CO2 equivalent, which of course is a fundamental change, also affecting the rewarding for renewable electricity deliveries. The ministry also intends to explore the inclusion of home charging in the system. At this stage, it's not part of the system, but from 2025, the ministry intends to include it. But how this will be done, under what conditions, will be decided in 2024. Also relevant, as NIA, as the competent authority, we see a large number of small bookers entering the system, especially for electricity, with little contribution to the HBE system in a quantitative manner as a whole, but causing a big administrative burden for us. And to deal with this competent authority point of view, the ministry also intends to introduce a booking threshold in kilowatt hours. So a certain threshold will need to be exceeded in order to have an account in the system to be able to book deliveries of electricity. And also a booking service provider will be introduced in the legislation to prevent that every single small booker must need its own account. There will be a defined booking service provider being able to do bookings on behalf of smaller companies to reduce both the administrative burden at our side, but also the administrative burden at the side of the bookers. And at last, the ministry must also decide on what modes of transport will be part of the system. For example, shore power is now part of the system. It has to be decided whether it will remain part of the system. And for construction side, non-road mobile machinery, perhaps an inclusion makes sense. So it's also decisions like that that will need to be taken by the ministry next year. So that's a short preview to 25 and a brief explanation of the system we have in the Netherlands. Any questions can be addressed to our help desk. And of course, many answers can be found on our website. I now hand it over to you again. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaap, very much for giving us this overview of the Dutch system. I particularly take away the digitalization aspect, which I think should be upheld and taken up in many other parts of the administration as well. So that is a very wonderful, good practice. Thank you very much again. We are now going to move into the industry presentations. So today with us we have various ChargeUp Europe members who have practical experience working with different credit mechanisms across the EU. We are going to start with Arthur Maronier, who is the head of energy at Electra, who will be talking about Electra's experience with the French credit mechanism. So Arthur, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. As said, I will focus on our experience with the French e-credit mechanism, which is called ChargeUp. So next slide. Electra is a charge point operator that is present currently in 8 countries in Europe. And I will focus on the French system mostly because that's where we started our business 2 years ago. And the way the French e-credit mechanism works, if we go to the next slide, is that is based on renewable. Sorry, it's the next slide. I went a little fast. On renewable energies only. So it's not a system that is based on carbon emissions, contrary to other countries. And so you can value up to 25% of the energy that is used to charge cars if you're connected directly to the grid, because that's the renewable share in France. Electricity benefits from a multiplier of 4 with respect to the other kind of biofuel. So that's similar, I think, to most other countries. You can benefit from 100% coefficient, renewable energy coefficient, if the charge points are directly connected to solar panels, for example, or any form of local source of generation, renewable generation. And it is really the first year of the mechanism. It was announced 2022. It actually really started this year in 2023. And the first calculation, this is really early on, but give an estimate of around 60 to 70 euro per megawatt hour in expected extra subside for CPOs. The future markets will be hard to predict because what we see for next year is increasing mandates that are pretty slowly increasing, actually, as decided by the French government. And we don't know if the prices we've seen for the very first year of the mechanism are just early bird prices or if they will really maintain themselves. If we go back to the previous slide, my point here was just to really insist on the fact that e-credits are really different from the classic types of incentives that we do need in infrastructure that are very CapEx incentives. So all the incentives that focus on deploying stations on all the CapEx costs are very important to go fast, to deploy fast, and to trigger new investments. But e-credits are special in the way that they act on the OpEx rather than the CapEx. And so they directly act on the energy cost and so on the competitiveness, between electric mobility and carbon-based mobility. So next slide, please. This diagram is to show you what electricity can replace in terms of obligations in France. You have diesel and gasoline incorporation mandates of renewable targets in general. Again, these are renewable targets and not GHG targets. And what electricity can replace right now is the first generation of biofuels that is capped and the 1.5 generation. But it cannot replace the second generation, and this has an impact on the price of e-credits, as the second generation of biofuels are usually the most costly ones. So the price will be a little decreased for electricity until maybe one day they're made and they're enabled to replace this generation. Next slide. I think now if we zoom out, there are 3 main factors that are really important for a e-credit mechanism to work in an efficient manner. The first one is the administrative process. Second one is are the conditions under which the direct connection can be established. And the last one is the financial visibility. On the administrative process, what was done in France during this first year in 2023 was some form of beta testing with some voluntary CPOs in the beginning of the year to test the data, to test the platform, try to do some numbers and some examples. Then we entered a phase of electric meters certification. And what was, I think, nice about this mechanism is that we, as CPOs, were not asked to certify 100% of our stations, but only 10 to 15%. So basically a random batch, and that makes things much faster, I think. And then the phase we're entering right now is we're waiting to be fully integrated into a common platform that already actually exists for biofuels, and that will be extended to electricity credits. In a parallel manner, the problem and what's missing right now in France and what's really important for e-credit mechanism, and I think this was said before, is to be able to automatically integrate our consumption data into a platform run by the government. And up to today, we're still doing it manually in France, and that's a true burden. It's very complicated. And so the next step will be really to have an API, an automatic consumption reporting platform. Next slide, please. So to summarize, what's really important is the batch certification that I mentioned in terms of administrative process, but also the fact that we can generate certificates month by month or week by week, that we don't have to wait for the end of the year. I know this is the case, I think, in some other countries, maybe in Austria, and this will not enable a proper functioning market. The API data platform I mentioned. Another point that is needed is to ease the conditions under which you can benefit from the direct connection coefficient. And by this, I mean being able, for example, to have your charging points on the same big parking lot as solar panels without requiring them to be directly connected behind the exact same meter. I think we can find a form of physical distance definition or even this distance with respect to the grid that can be found and really will help us find real cases of application. Otherwise, this will be really limited. And the financial visibility is, of course, very important to secure all the investments and to give long-term signals. This is guaranteeing the multiplier, which is ×4 in most countries, giving it like a time scale, enlarging the scope of the mandates covered by electricity. I mentioned the possibility of replacing second-generation biofuels that will also help develop electric mobility, and find a way to give an indirect floor price for e-credits through 5 or 10-year visibility on the tax and on the mandates. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur, for sharing your experience with the French mechanism. I'm now going to move to Moritz Bollen, who is the team lead for smart charging at RIF, who will talk about their experience with the German mechanism. Moritz, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Gabriele. Yeah, so I have the pleasure to talk about the German Treibhausgasminderungsquote, or greenhouse gas reduction quota, short greenhouse gas quota, that has been touched upon before. Yeah, let's just directly jump into it. Yeah, so a short overview. So the greenhouse gas quota was implemented in 2015 already, and is basically the market-based successor of the original biofuel quota that just mandated a certain proportion of fuels to stem from bioenergy. Since 2018, the instrument is in general open to crediting electricity from renewable energy sources, but only since 2022, beginning of 2022, it's really interesting for e-mobility. Up to that point, only the companies who are bringing the electricity into the market, so the electricity and retailing companies, were eligible to use the quota, and since then, it's actually the CPOs. Additionally, it changed from one-time accounting to threefold accounting, so it also became much more interesting from my financial perspective. The current reduction level that is required is 8%, and what it means is the overall emissions of road transport need to be 8% lower than in the case of just bringing in carbon fuels. And you can do that, of course, by bringing in biofuels, but also by electricity meanwhile. And this amount is set to increase to 25% in 2030. In Germany, the quotas are assigned for both public charging on a per kilowatt hour basis, so metered, but also private charging, as shown by Gerd in the beginning. So it's a fixed amount per vehicle. Per battery electric vehicle, no plug-in hybrids are included here. And it's differentiated by class. So a normal car gets only 2,000 kilowatt hours per year. Trucks and buses get more. The role that we have at Reef is that we are aggregating these quotas via our charge point management system for the CPOs, which are our customers. And then we are cooperating with service companies, and they are trading then these quotas, and we make additional revenue accessible for our CPOs, both for the vehicles, but also for public charging. So we started with this in middle of 2022, and since then we had some positive experiences and some negative ones. I would start with the benefits of this mechanism. It for sure reduces the total cost of ownership for battery electric vehicles, and it gives an additional push for faster electrification of commercial fleets. So I think that's really positive. And what we also see in our backend is that it creates a high incentive to make already existing infrastructure publicly available. Because if you make it publicly available, you get these certain amount of cents per kilowatt hours on top, and we see really that our customers are switching. At least currently, there is no excessive paperwork, at least for the end consumers or for the owners of battery electric vehicles. They're basically uploading their registration certificate and giving some billing data, and then after a certain period, they receive the money. Also, the current market prices are still quite interesting, and I think are still sufficient to achieve a certain steering effect. They're making carbon fuels more expensive, they're making e-mobility cheaper, and I mean, that's the desired outcome, right? The price levels we're currently talking about is for public charging, it's about 10 cents per kilowatt hour this year. And for private charging, so per vehicle, let's say the vehicle class M1, which is just a normal car, it's about 200 euros. So that's it for the positive side. And I think the greenhouse gas mechanism in essence worked quite well, but I think there is also certain room for improvement. So yeah, thank you. The first point is that all these quotas, created quotas, need to be checked by the Environment Agency, German Environment Agency, so by the Umweltbundesamt, and this processing duration is quite long. So it takes between 2 to 5 months in our experience, which is also due to the fact that there are still some manual processes, so we're still missing a certain amount of digitization. So Arthur, I agree with you. And also, mainly in the beginning, there were certain gray areas, especially concerning the definition of public charging. So there were, for example, some creative aggregating companies who were then defining actually private chargers in private garages as public charging, because they argued that they were open for 1 week, for 1 hour per week, and therefore, defined this as public, which is of course not in the interest of the regulation. This is also due to the fact that a really clear and coherent guidance was missing initially. Meanwhile, that improved a lot. So the Umweltbundesamt is providing a really good Q&A session so that market participants really know what they're supposed to do and what not. So initially, I think it was a lot of Wild West behavior, but we see that this improved a lot. And the last point is, it's a regulation, of course, so regulatory risk for all market participants is really high. And we saw that in a recent example. So in the beginning of 2023, a new form of biofuel made it on a list of acceptable fuels. This is the so-called brown grease that can be imported, for example, from China at a really low price. And this led to a massive oversupply in the market. It's a market-based mechanism, right? This is by definition. And of course, then collapsing prices, which poses challenges for the whole and really young business, of course. If you jump to the next slide. So this is just to give you a feeling for the dimension of the price drop. So in 2022, an owner of a battery electric vehicle could make about 300 euros, maybe even 400 euros, depending on the time he uploaded his vehicle. That's a lot of money. For 2023, we're talking about 200 euros, meanwhile a bit less. And if we're looking at the forecast for next year, we're probably down to 90 euros. So this also was followed and had repercussions in the sense of some aggregators going in, filing for insolvency because they did not anticipate this massive price drop. Next slide, please. Just a short outlook on the current developments. So what we see is that it's getting more sophisticated, the mechanism. So recently, there was a better representation of trucks. So the vehicle classes N2 and E3 are now taken into consideration and receive more quotas. That's a positive thing for sure. And what we see is that from next year onwards, we will also have the consideration of local renewable electricity generation, so of PV. Arthur, this is basically what you also talked about. This will be implemented next year, so you just need to prove that you produce this electricity locally by probably sending in the meter values, and then you will get a higher quota because the electricity is completely green and has, I don't know, probably close to 0 grams per kilowatt hour. Unfortunately, to the best of our knowledge, there will be no adjustment with respect to the eligible fuels. So especially talking about biofuels from other countries. And therefore, the market prices are expected to remain low. So at about 150 euros per ton of CO2 reduction. As a reminder, we're coming from a level of 450 to 500 tons. I have some suggestions on what could be taken into consideration when setting up the European rollout. So first, I think it makes sense to include private charging because it fosters the public support for the transition, because really owners of battery electric vehicles are directly profiting. But prior to setting up such a mechanism, I think it makes sense to really establish a digital certification procedure so that the manual effort is limited and that the certification really is something that happens quickly. Also to reduce the financial risk for market participants, because if you have obligations to your customers, but at the same time you need to wait several months in order to get the money, this of course is a risky business. Furthermore, I think it needs a really clear definition of the eligible fuels. And if you're about to change something on that list, then you need to really have a careful assessment on how that might impact market prices. And we see that it has a really strong effect by the example here from Germany. And the last point is we have like an implicit price cap in the German market, which is the fine that mineral oil companies need to pay if they cannot reduce accordingly, which is 600 euros per ton of CO2. But on the other hand, we don't have a floor price. So I think it needs like a predictable price band in order to really foster investment into e-mobility. Because no fleet manager will invest if he's super uncertain whether these revenues will come or not. And this could, for example, be implemented by having like a dynamic reduction target. So as soon as a certain threshold is surpassed downwards, one could dynamically increase the target for that year, and there would be additional demand and prices would go up back into the price band. That would just be one suggestion, but I'm happy to discuss that. Thanks, that's it. Last slide, just if you want to reach out, feel free. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Maurice, for this very concise and clear presentation, and indeed for outlining the importance of the implementation, and also outlining the volatility of this mechanism if not implemented properly. I think for a young industry like EV charging, legal certainty with these sorts of things that require investment that could potentially be lucrative is extremely important. So as we move into the implementation stage, these good practices and the advice that you have shared, I'm sure will be very useful to many member states around the EU. So thank you very much. We are now going to move into the last presentation by Roland van der Put, who is the energy sourcing manager at Fastnet. And he will talk about about Fastnet's experience with the Dutch credit mechanism indeed. So Roland, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gabriela. I've already explained a lot about the mechanism in the Netherlands, so I'll mostly focus on our experience. So on the next slide, so we started more than 11 years ago, and at the time there were hardly any electric vehicles on the road. So in all those years, we opened a lot of stations, and this is a very capital-intensive business. So 10 years ago, we had 0 sessions. We had occasionally a customer that drove an EV, and now last quarter we handled more than 1 million sessions, and we delivered 25 gigawatts hours of electricity. We've been using the Dutch credit system of HPEs since 2017. At the times, the volumes were still low, but we already benefited from the value of these credits. So on the next slide, there is an overview of the revenues that we received from these credits. So I'm giving you the volumes that we publish in our annual report. And as you can see, the first column, the credits that we get, are substantial numbers. So it was 3.3 million euros last year of the combined Netherlands and Germany credit mechanisms. And this year, for the first half of the year, we are at 1.6 million. And although our revenue grew a lot, the prices for the credits in both Germany and the Netherlands, they fell. So they went down compared to the previous year. And that has a major impact on how much money we can invest basically. So that already demonstrates that more stable prices will definitely help with the business case, because you can see that the share of the credits compared to our total income based on charging is declining over the years. From 2021 to 2022 and to 2023. In the Netherlands, the credit mechanism gives us about 3 to 5 cents per kilowatt hour of additional income. And we hope at least that it stays within that range, because then it can make a difference. On the next slide, I'll show you what we do with this additional income. So it's a very capital intensive activity to build fast charging stations. And particularly if you're expanding into areas where there's limited EV drivers around, you're not sure how quickly you can recover the investments. You need to cover up all the money up front for the grid connections, the transformers, all the civil works, and the fast chargers, in our case also the canopies, in order to have a good functioning charging station. So then any additional income based on these credits, that helps to improve the business case. And improving the business case and reducing the operational cost of a charging station, that allows us to roll out more fast charging infrastructure quicker. And having more fast charging infrastructure on the road basically helps to put more electric vehicles on the road, because then everyone can drive around and charge wherever they please. So additional income, really valuable. Next slide, please. So what are the positives of the system in the Netherlands? Jaap already explained, it's an online system. And also, as Morris is referring to, it's really good to have a platform that supports the process. So we love the fact that it is an online portal, and you can define multiple users and multiple roles in that online portal. So if you're part of a bigger company, then it's really helpful to have these multiple roles and multiple users in there. It also allows a workflow whereby someone initiates a transaction or a mutation and another one approves the transaction or the mutation. So then, similar to a company structure, you have a 4I principle on important transactions in the system. And finally, regarding the system itself, the security is also very good, because it has two-factor authentication. We would not want anyone to hack the system and see our data, because then they are able to figure out what the volumes were we sold at particular stations. So the data is very sensitive. So also the security needs to be well in place also. Having this online system allows us to upload the credits when we wish. Currently, we do this every month. And every month, we upload a file with all the data. So we can prepare the file quite easily based on our data warehouse that we have in our company. And then uploading takes about 30 minutes. So that process is relatively easy and scalable as well, because it's almost the same amount of time, whether it's 10 locations or 100 or 500 locations. So for us, having that ability to upload data is key. Finally, what we like is that it's not based on chargers. or connectors, but that this is based on locations or grid connections. Since most companies deploy multiple chargers on a single location, it helps to be able to bundle all that data into a single entry into this platform. It saves a lot of lines in the system. Now, of course, with any system, there are positives, but there are also some improvement points. So I will also share with you what are the improvement points that we see in the system. So next slide, please. So improvement points, it's complicated to claim 100% renewable energy for energy that is produced locally. So you have to go to various hoops in order to make it work, and that's not very easy to do. Compared to the amount of work for regular energy taken from the grid, the amount of work to claim 100% renewable energy is an order of magnitude more. So it's not very attractive to do it unless the volumes are really high. And a very practical thing that we see in the Dutch system, that it uses the name of the location as the key identifier. Yeah, and that's very hard because a slight spelling mistake or error in there messes up the upload system. So in order to make this more scalable, we would love to use a unique identifier like the grid identification code or the AIN code in the Netherlands. Jaap already mentioned there's a mandatory annual verification. And that's very understandable because, you want to be sure that whatever we upload as a user into the system is actually backed up by data. For us, we are a listed company, and I'm basically telling the story twice of how the process works and doing the testing twice of this whole mechanism, this whole process. So if there's a way to reduce the duplicate effort, that would be great. Right now, in terms of timing and scope, it's not really working out to prevent this duplication, unfortunately. Moritz also explained a lot about the price, and the part of the problem is also there's no publicly available index. So it's not like it's listed on the Euronext. You have to call brokers in order to get a feel for the price. So it's difficult to track what the current price is doing. And that may lead to a barrier to entry for smaller players on the market, because you need to know the people that can give you a quote before you can actually make a transaction. And all the fluctuations in the price make it hard to take decisions for a long-term business case. So we see currently the credits as a bonus to the business case rather than as an essential foundation to the business case. Since the price is also dropping steadily over the years, we learned that we cannot rely on this as an investment that we can include in our business case for the next years. So we see it as a bonus, and we do reinvest all the money that we recover. But it would be very helpful to have a longer-term view on the price and maybe have some more dynamic approach, as Moritz already alluded to, because that will help solidify the business case for everyone. But that's it from my experience. And I hope that the implementations in other countries can learn from this as well.
Thank you very much, Roland, for this valuable insights. Indeed, we hope that with the implementation, which is coming up next in the next few years across the EU, we can create a bit more certainty with this mechanism and really create more value also for the EV charging sector to be able to benefit from it, if nothing else, to provide the best service possible to the end user. We are on 4:30, but there is one more thing that we'd like to cover. As we mentioned at the beginning, there are 4 more or less mechanisms at the moment functioning around Europe. So we did not talk very much in detail about the Austrian mechanism today, but we would still like to take a minute or two to quickly cover it, and I turn to Moritz to do that.
Sure, Gabriele. If you want to, you can share one of the backup slides, but I can also just talk about it. So in general, the Austrian E-Prämie is by design pretty close to the German greenhouse gas quota. That's also the reason for many German aggregating companies now turning to Austria. It's also covering private and public charging. The numbers are differing a bit. So per vehicle, the assumption is that the private charging makes 1,500 kilowatt hours, so a bit less, and they are also not differentiating regarding vehicle classes. There are some differences. For example, the kilowatt per vehicle can be increased if this is proven by disclosing the data of your charge point. So you can go beyond this 1,500 if you charge more. By disclosing the data of the charge point, you can also get additional revenue for plug-in hybrids. The vehicle classes I mentioned. And what is also important in Germany, when you upload your registration certificates, you get the money irrespective of whether you had the car for 3 months or for the whole year. This is different in Austria. So in Austria, you will only get the payout in the following year because the environmental agency needs to check whether you had this vehicle really for the whole 12 months, and otherwise you just get a certain share of it. And then this brings me to the really last point, which is actually the most important one, because the price levels currently for the Austrian markets are really high. So for public charging, it's ranging at about 30 cents per kilowatt hour, which is probably more than the electricity currently costs in Austria. And for a vehicle, then, of course, doing the math, it's 450 euros per vehicle. So given the low price levels in Germany, many companies that are active in the greenhouse gas quota business are now turning to Austria because there is still money in the market. And the reason I think for this is that it's a younger mechanism, that they were more careful in the definition of biofuels. The electricity mix in general is cleaner or greener, lower CO2 content, so the reductions of e-mobility are larger. And in combination, this makes a really interesting market for carbon trading. That's a short summary. So if there are more questions on that, please feel free to reach out.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are not able to take any more questions as we are already over time. We do have a few interesting questions in the chat, and thank you so much for submitting them. You are free to reach out to any of the speakers or to ChargeUp Europe at secretariat@chargeupeurope.eu, or find us on social media and reach us this way, and we'll be happy to answer any questions. The recording of the webinar will also be available in the next few days. And most importantly, thank you so very much to all the speakers that have joined us today to share their experience with the presentations. And thank you to our audience for joining us as well for this highly niche and technical, but apparently extremely important topic, especially for the years to come. We are very happy to have had you here, and we look forward to seeing you in the future webinars of our organizations. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of the afternoon.